Good afternoon. All set to go? All right, we can bring in the jury.
Please remain standing, jury entering. Please be seated.
All right, good afternoon. While you're getting your notebooks ready, I'll turn to the defense to call your next witness.
That's all Jenna for Sears.
Good afternoon. Turn to the back side of the witness stand, and once you arrive, if you would kindly raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you give to the jury will be the truth and the whole truth under the penalties of perjury?
I do.
Please be seated. And although you don't have to pull the microphone closer, if you could just pull it down a little, that should be good, and try to keep your voice up as best you can. Counsel?
Thank you. Good afternoon, Ms. Sears. Can you introduce yourself and spell your name for the record, please?
My name is Jennifer Sears, Jenniffer, Sears, Sears.
And I put a glass of water up there for you. Ms. Sears, can you tell us where you currently work?
I'm currently employed with DNA Labs International.
Okay. And we'll get back to that. Where did you work before that lab?
I worked for a laboratory called NMS Labs.
Okay. And for what years did you work at NMS Labs?
I was with NMS from 2006 until 2021.
And when you were, well, during 2017 through 2019, you worked at NMS Labs?
Correct.
And what was your position and responsibilities at NMS Labs around that time?
I was a forensic biologist.
And can you explain what being a forensic biologist entailed?
Forensic biologists examine items of evidence for biological material to possibly perform serology or body fluid identification and DNA analysis.
And in your role at NMS, did you perform tests in both of those categories?
Yes.
And about how many cases do you think you've reviewed throughout your career?
I couldn't give an exact number, but well into the hundreds.
And what is your current position at your current lab?
At my current lab, I am a senior DNA analyst.
Okay. And can you explain a little bit more what that entails?
It's a similar role to what I held at my previous laboratory, with the exception of I don't do lab work. I do more of the back end of the workflow, which consists of report writing and review, and testimony as needed.
And when it comes to review, were you doing review when you were also at NMS?
Yes.
And what did that entail?
So a case report, once it's generated, will go through something called a technical review. So the analyst who is responsible for putting the case together does their own review when they're compiling it to make sure that everything is complete. But it then goes through a secondary review by a peer, essentially, to verify the contents of the case file.
And what does that verification look like?
Going through and making sure that everything's in order, that all the proper documentation is there, that all the policies were followed.
And what about if any edits were made? Are those something that you would look at as a reviewer?
Yes.
And would you ensure that those edits were correct?
Yes.
Can you explain to the jury what your educational background is?
I have a Bachelor's of Science in Biology with a concentration in Forensic Science from Cedar Crest College in Allentown, Pennsylvania.
And do you have other specialized training when it comes to this field?
Yes, I have several years of on-the-job training. I started at NMS Labs as actually as an evidence processor, which is a technician essentially, and then moved my way up to becoming a forensic biologist, which included at least a year-long training program. So I have that initial training. I additionally went through some training when I started at my new laboratory as well. And I also am proficiency tested every year and do continuing education.
And what did the proficiency testing at NMS Labs look like?
So the proficiency tests take place twice a year, and they are set up like a normal case, except that they come from an external agency. So they come from a company or a laboratory that generates proficiency tests. So we work them as we would a normal case without knowing what the correct results are supposed to be. And then they get sent off to that agency to essentially be graded and determined whether or not we've passed.
Now, if you're doing a proficiency test, does that mean you do every stage of a case analysis?
It would depend on what you are currently competent in at the time. So whatever your primary job role is at the time is what you would perform on that proficiency.
And for every role that you had at NMS, did you do proficiency testing for that role?
Yes.
And on top of that, were you doing continuing education or training?
Yes.
Can you explain to the jury a little bit about what those entailed?
So we have a set amount of hours of continuing education that we need to complete every year, which comes in the form of conference attendances, webinars, journal readings, things like that.
And are you a member of any professional organizations?
I am.
And which ones are those?
I am a member of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences and also the International Society for Forensic Genetics.
And do you hold a license in forensics?
I do hold a license for the state of Texas. That is a requirement for them, that their analysts be individually licensed in order to perform work in their state. And because I have throughout my career worked for private laboratories, we have done work for that state, so we need to have that license.
And on top of attending professional conferences, have you presented at conferences?
I have not recently. I have had some posters some years ago that I was a part of that were presented.
And have you published before?
No, I have research in my college research, my undergraduate research was published as a group in a undergraduate research journal. But other than that, no.
Now, you said at NMS you passed, or you took proficiency examinations. Did you pass those?
Yes.
And was NMS Labs, was that an accredited lab?
Yes.
And did you have to, was the proficiency testing part of being in the lab, or was it part of being in the field?
Can you rephrase that?
Well, you mentioned that you were licensed. Was the proficiency examinations because of your license, or was it because of what the lab itself required?
That's because of what the lab itself required. That's required for DNA analysts at all labs. So I'm required to do that proficiency testing at my current lab as well.
And by what organizations was NMS accredited?
They were accredited by ANAB, which stands for the American National Standard Institute National Accreditation Board.
And you mentioned that you've been working at private labs like NMS. So does that mean it's not affiliated with any particular state or any state agency?
That's correct.
Have you testified in court before on the subject?
I have.
Have you been qualified as an expert on the subject of DNA analysis?
I have.
And approximately how many times?
Approximately 30 times.
Your Honor, at this point, I move to qualify Ms. Sears as an expert in DNA analysis.
All right, she'll be so qualified.
One more question about your time at NMS generally. Was it common to get requests for testing from outside agencies or outside states?
Yes,
That probably made up the majority of your requests.
a good proportion, yes.
So the jurors have heard quite a bit about the New Hampshire State Laboratory, but since NMS is private and received requests from other agencies, kind of want to ask you to go through the step-by-step process of how requests were received and how the evidence was processed.
Okay.
So can you just say the first step of how evidence is received or a request is received or a package is received?
So we had at NMS, as many forensic laboratories do, an evidence receiving department, and this was sort of our front end receiving. They were responsible for receiving all of the evidence in from, be it drop off from a police agency or via a courier like FedEx or UPS. They would receive that evidence in and start an internal chain of custody. So they would say that they received it from that agency or from FedEx. They would document that tracking number, and then they would log it into our system, give it a unique identifier, so a unique case number, our case number, and then it would be stored in the evidence vault, which is a secured room that only certain individuals have access to, until it was ready to be tested by the analyst who was going to be examining the evidence.
And can you explain if there were processes to, or systems to prevent the contamination of these samples?
So upon the receipt of the evidence, they ensure that it's received sealed, and if for some reason it's not properly sealed, they would rectify that seal upon receiving it at our laboratory. And then again, it's placed directly into the secured vault, which only authorized personnel have access to. Once it is removed from the vault and the screening process begins, all of the evidence is labeled with those identifiers, so you know which case it belongs to. It's labeled with a ID number, so you know which item it is. And then it is screened, each item is screened individually by the analyst who's going to be doing the evidence collection.
And what does that screening process look like?
So they would remove it from the evidence vault. They would bring it into an examination room, which is a sort of separate closed-off room. They would work on a cleaned table that they've cleaned down with bleach and water, and a clean piece of paper, almost like a butcher paper, that they put down on the table. And the evidence is then placed on there. Any photographs that are going to be taken are generated, and you do any type of collection, any cutting, any swabbing that you need to do. Each of those items is going to be opened separately. So one item is going to be opened, it's going to be documented, it's going to be sampled, it's going to be sealed back up and put away. And that process continues until all of the items in the case that we currently would have are sampled.
Is there a process or a system to make sure that when an item is removed, it goes back into the package that it said it was in to make sure it doesn't get separated?
That largely has to do with only opening one item at a time. So like I said, the item is sealed. The items are individually sealed when they come in. We receive them as they are. We open one item, we place it onto the paper. We have a scale that we put down that has our case number, our item number on it, that we set next to that item, and then once it's completed, it goes back into its package. We don't have multiple items out at a time, essentially.
And can you sort of lay out what happens during the analysis process?
So for the DNA analysis process, once your evidence is screened and you've collected whatever samples you need to take, so that may be a cutting of a swab, that may be a swabbing that you've collected yourself of an item, you take your sample, your individual sample of that item, and it goes into a sterile tube. And this is the portion of the evidence that's going to move forward for DNA testing. So that tube gets labeled with the case's unique marking. So it gets the case number, it gets the exhibit number of that item. So that way we can ensure that, you know, this item is what went into this tube. And those markings, those unique markings, that case number, that exhibit number, they follow the individual sample throughout the DNA process. So the first step in that process is going to be something called extraction, and that's where it's a chemical process that takes place in the tube. That's where we actually break open the cells and release the DNA in the cells into solution. The second step in the process is something called quantitation, and that is where we determine approximately how much DNA is present in our sample. And this is important for our next step, which is the amplification step. And this is where we actually target the specific areas of the DNA that we want to look at, that we want to actually go in and generate a profile from. And then the fourth step and final step in the process is the analysis phase. And this is where those specific areas on the DNA that we targeted are actually separated out, and a DNA profile is generated.
And are there controls during this process? And if so, what are they?
Yes. So at NMS, we did something called an extraction control, which would start at the first stage at the extraction process. It was sort of like a positive control. It was a known sample, so it would be a known sample of blood, I believe is what we used to use. So we knew who it came from. We knew the donor. We knew what the profile was supposed to be. So we would use that throughout the process to sort of verify that our extraction worked from the beginning. We also use something called a reagent control, which is a blank, essentially a negative control. And this is a tube that just gets filled throughout the process with only the reagents that are used. And this is to ensure that there's no contamination in the reagents that we're using, and also that no contamination might pop up during the process.
You mentioned a little bit about what happens in the review stage, which comes after. Are there more than one stages of review, or just a technical review?
So at NMS, we broke our reviews up into two main categories. Really, we had a data review, a data analysis and review. So once the data was actually generated from that last step, that analysis process, that data would be analyzed by an analyst, and then it would be reviewed by another analyst. Once that step was complete, the results of that would then be used in the generation of the report and the interpretation of the profiles. And then a case file would be compiled, including all of that data, a report generated, and then it once again goes through another sort of overall technical review.
Excuse me. And then what happens after these stages of review? What is the next step?
So once all the stages of review are complete, including the last big technical review, that means that the case is ready to be released. The report is ready to be generated.
Okay, and does that mean the case is ready to enter the comparison stage?
So the comparison stage actually happens after the first review. So once that data review takes place, the data is analyzed and it's reviewed, the interpretation takes place, the comparisons take place. That takes place, and then all of that goes into the case report and the case file, and then goes through the final technical review. So there's one review after the data analysis and one review after the entire case file is complete.
And from start to finish in this process, are there points where there are witnesses that observe to ensure reliability or accuracy?
Yes, so during the laboratory process, so those 4 steps that I explained, extraction, quant, amplification, and analysis, we have witness steps. So what those are a second set of eyes, essentially, when you're in the laboratory. So there are technicians performing these laboratory processes. They need to manipulate tubes, manipulate chemicals into the tubes, move liquids around. So when tubes are being switched around, when things are being moved at various stages, we would have witnesses in place to come in and verify that everything lined up, to say, okay, yes, this sample is this sample, this is going into this tube, that's correct, to kind of follow that process to make sure that there's no sample switch along the way.
So turning to this case, in early 2017, did you receive a request from New Hampshire to test items related to the homicide of 2 women?
Yes.
And do you remember the nature of that request?
So there was a request for YSTRs, which is male-specific DNA. It means that we are looking at locations specifically on the Y chromosome, the male chromosome. The first submission in the case that came in were 2 sets of fingernails to be swabbed, to have the undersides of the fingernails swabbed.
And when you say sets of fingernails, can you explain what a set means?
So clippings from the individual fingers.
And would that be every finger?
I believe so. I'd have to refer to my notes if it was each finger, but I believe it was 5. I believe it was 5 nails from each hand.
Okay. Do you want to check, or do you feel fairly confident in that?
I can go ahead and check. Let me see.
And if you can refer to the number that's on that when you refer to your notes.
Sure.
Go to the page. May I approach?
Yes.
Okay.
I know that you organize yours in a different way,
Yeah.
but I found the pages if you needed to refer to them.
Yes, that's what I have as well. Yep, okay. And it does look like it was 1 set of fingernail clippings from each hand. So 5 fingernails from the left hand, 5 fingernails from the right hand, 2 sets of those from 2 individuals.
And can you tell me what swabbing the fingernails entails?
Sure. So we do something called a double swab technique at NMS, where we would go over the surface that we were going to try to collect DNA from twice. First with a moistened swab in an attempt to sort of loosen up any type of debris or anything that may be there, and then with a dry swab to attempt to pick up anything that may have been left behind. So in this case, of the 4 sets of fingernails, so 1 left, 1 right from 1 individual, 1 left, 1 right from a second individual, 2 swabs were collected from each of those sets. So the 5 fingernail clippings from each hand were swabbed as a whole.
And so you mentioned those 4 items. Did you receive other items as part of that request?
Initially, we received the reference sample, a reference sample from Timothy Verrill initially in that first submission.
And then the next, there was one that came, a request that came later, an item that came later?
Yes.
And what was that?
That was 2 rings.
So I'm showing identified as Defense Exhibit AI. There's a full exhibit. Before we go any further in this, is this a chart that you reviewed before you testified today?
Yes.
And did you compare this to the notes from your file?
Yes.
And did you verify that the information on this is accurate?
Yes.
Okay. So I want to go back to the reference sample. When you received the reference sample, what did you do with it?
So this was received, again, I'm going to refer to my notes if I can. Okay, so for this reference sample, we received two fiber tip swabs, so essentially Q-tips, two fancy Q-tips that were given as a reference from Timothy Verrill. And with a sample like this, we would take, when it's swabs, we would take a cutting from the swab. That's what gets sent forward in that tube for DNA analysis. So we took a cutting from one of those two swabs and sent it forward through that DNA process that I explained.
And during that stage, did you use the anti-contamination efforts that you discussed earlier?
Yes, it went through the same procedures as explained.
And did you conduct a review of the analysis of that sample?
So my role, again, I'm going to refer to my notes. So for this particular sample, looks like I was the reviewer on that first review stage for the data. So as I explained, there's two separate reviews at NMS, one for the data, one for the final case file. It looks like I did the review for the data for the sample.
And did you notice anything unusual or that would have violated the protocols or systems at NMS?
No, I did not.
And regarding that sample and ultimately all of these, did you engage in comparisons?
Yes.
So I want to turn to the other 5 items that are up there on the chart in Defense Exhibit AI. You had mentioned that you had received 4 sets of fingernails and a set of rings. Now, you mentioned earlier that there was a internal number for NMS labs for each case that came through. Do you remember what the case number was for this case?
So the case number for this case is 17 WLG 002234.
And is there an internal number generated for each item of evidence when you receive it?
Yes.
So if you look, reading from top to, at the top row, from left to right, there's numbers that say EX1, 2, 3, 4, 6, and 5. Are those the numbers that are generated by, or that were generated by NMS?
Yes, they are. Those represent something called exhibit numbers. So those represent the individual samples that were taken from an item.
And do those, you reviewed this chart earlier, do they accurately reflect your reports from this case?
Yes.
So I want to start with the fingernails. You mentioned that you did some swabbing. Now, briefly, can you tell us what happened during the first, or what the first testing of the fingernails resulted in?
So the first set of DNA testing from the fingernails resulted in no profiles for all 4 sets.
And did you eventually retest those items?
Yes.
Okay. So we'll get back to that, but I kind of want to stay chronological in how you worked through this case. So the next item that came in was item 6, which is TLE 54, Sullivan's right-hand rings. Were you involved in the analysis of those rings?
Yes.
And did you end up issuing a report regarding them?
Yes.
And you explained the swabbing process earlier for the fingernails. Was that a similar process here?
Yes.
Okay, and can you explain how you, well, let me just show you what the next picture is, which is Defense Exhibit X3. And do you recognize those rings as the ones that you swabbed?
Yes.
And can you explain where or how you swabbed those?
So the rings were swabbed on the exterior, on the exterior facing upwards, I guess you could say. So sort of in the area that appears where there might be a jewel, where the decorative part of the ring is. We were given the instruction that we were looking not for the wearer of the ring, but for someone that may have come in contact with the outside of the ring, as it would be if a person was wearing it when they came in contact.
And you could see in the picture that the rings appear to be broken or cut.
Mm-hmm.
They came to your lab in that condition, right?
Correct, yes.
And you mentioned the 2 swabs earlier with the fingernails. Did you also do 2 swabs with the rings?
Yes.
And was it 1 swab per ring or both swabs for 2 rings? How did that work?
They were sampled together.
And again, did that process include the anti-contamination protocols that you discussed earlier?
Yes.
So you just touched on what I was going to go to next, which is wearer DNA and touch DNA. The jurors have heard a little bit about that already. And I just want to clarify that what you were searching for here was touch DNA.
Yes, so any DNA that would have been left behind when an individual comes in contact with it, which is commonly referred to as touch DNA.
Does touch DNA explain to you how DNA got on a certain item?
No.
And does it tell you how long it's been on a certain item?
No, it does not.
So after you swabbed the rings, did you move through the process after that?
The DNA process, yes.
What was the next step in that?
So once the swabs were collected, they were sampled, so cuttings were taken from those swabs, placed into that tube with the unique markings, and then that sample went through those 4 steps of the DNA process.
And those also, did they go through the review process as well?
Yes.
And were you able to develop a DNA profile from those swabs?
Yes.
And what kind of profile was that? Was that a male or a female profile?
So this again was YSTR testing. So all of the samples that were tested by NMS in this case were all YSTR. So again, that's male-specific DNA. We're only looking at locations on the Y chromosome. So the profile that was developed was through that YSTR kit. So we know that that is male. It was a partial profile.
And when you say a partial profile, does that also mean a single profile, or were there more than one profile?
So in this case, it can mean, partial means incomplete. So what partial means is that of all of the locations on the DNA that we looked at, we were not able to obtain information at all of them. So that's what partial means. You can have a partial single source profile, which means that of what we are seeing, it is indicative of one person. So based off of the locations that we're seeing, we're not seeing indication of another individual. Or you can also have partial mixtures. So that means that, again, we didn't obtain data at all of the locations, but at those that we did, we are seeing an indication of more than one contributor. So for the rings, it was a very partial profile, the one that was developed, but it was, we were not seeing indication of more than one contributor.
Okay, and I'm going to go back to Defense Exhibit, excuse me, AI. And again, for the rings, it's the column that's second to the left, or second from the left, which is TLE 154. Can you explain what NR means?
So NR means no result.
And what does no result mean?
So that means, as I explained with what a partial profile is, that means that we did not obtain data at any of those locations with the NR.
And when you have a partial profile, what kind of conclusions are possible when you have a partial profile?
So that really depends on the profile. So you can exclude an individual, you can issue a cannot be excluded. So if we determine that we're looking at a profile and there is enough inconsistency there based off of what we're seeing in that question profile and the individuals that we're comparing it to's a known DNA profile, if there is enough difference there, we can exclude. So we can say that this person we do not believe contributed to this profile. You could, again, depending on the profile, determine that a person cannot be excluded. So that would mean that there would be enough similarity there that you would not be able to exclude them as contributing. Or sometimes, depending on the profile, you could have it be too complex that you feel you can't draw any conclusions.
I think you might have mentioned this earlier, touched upon this earlier, but the far left column, what do those letters and numbers represent?
So those letters and numbers are the individual locations on the DNA that we were looking at. So those are the locations that we targeted to go in and actually look at the number of repeats. When we are generating a DNA profile, what we're actually doing is we're going into these specific locations on the DNA and we are counting up the number of repeats of genetic code that appears at those locations. So that's what these numbers, not the numbers in that far left column, but the rest of the numbers and where the NRs are throughout the rest of the table, that's what those numbers represent. So some you see NR, meaning no result, others you see an 11 and a 12. Those represent the number of repeats at those locations. So in the far left, those are all of the locations, the names of the locations on the DNA that we were trying to obtain those number of repeats from.
And when you do the comparison analysis, are you comparing the locations on the samples that you develop against the known sample, the reference sample?
Yes.
And is that how you determine whether you conclude whether someone could be excluded or not excluded?
It depends on the profile. In some situations, you could have, depending on the type of DNA that you're looking at, if you're looking at YSTRs, if you're looking at autosomal or regular DNA, it can be a bit more complicated with than that. When you're looking at profiles that indicate one contributor, that don't indicate a mixture, and sometimes with certain mixtures, it is just essentially looking to compare if those number of repeats are consistent or not.
Now, were you able to make a comparison between the Timothy Verrill reference sample, the known sample, and TLE 154?
Yes.
And what was your conclusion on that?
So we concluded that he was excluded as a contributor.
Okay, is that because the numbers in the column TLE 154 conflict in some way with the numbers in the reference sample column?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm showing you a physical copy of Defendant's Exhibit AI. And I've left a red pen here. On the column TLE 154, would you be able to circle the location that led to the exclusion of Timothy Verrill's sample?
Yes, and actually, if I can just, if you don't mind, if I can refer to my, yeah, please do, because I actually have this sort of already done in my own notes here. Circle, okay.
The reason for the exclusion. Okay. So circle the number 23, which is corresponding to the road DSY 481. And again, you said this was a very partial profile, like there are only 3 locations.
That's correct, yes.
But when an exclusion is made, does do the amount of locations matter when it comes to an exclusion?
For a single source profile, or a profile that is indicative of one contributor, all of the markers, or alleles as we call them, so the name of those numbers that you see represented there are called alleles. Those are the name of those individual repeats. All of those markers are obligate or required, essentially, in order for an individual to not be able to be excluded. So in this case, we only had 3 of those markers that came up. So we only had 3 numbers to compare to. One of them was inconsistent, and so we were able to exclude based off of that location.
Now, let's say theoretically you have a known sample that's compared to a partial profile like that, where there are only 3 locations, and the known sample matches those 3 locations. What type of conclusion can you make from that?
So at NMS, that would have, if those 3 locations were consistent, we would have determined that he could not have been excluded from that.
Okay. And are there sort of gradations or a spectrum of when someone cannot be excluded, sort of a statistical analysis?
When an individual cannot be excluded, a statistic would be generated, sort of adding weight to that conclusion.
Okay. Is it fair to say the more locations, the more, and the more those are consistent, that the more likely that person matches the source?
I wouldn't necessarily say that, but I would say that the more locations that you have, you're sort of working with more information. So you're going to have a little bit of a stronger statistic. Especially with YSTRs, you're dealing with additional limitations. So partiality is an issue. The profile not being complete is an issue, but there's also a little bit less specificity with YSTRs. So I wouldn't go so far as to say that it would be more concrete necessarily that the individual is there, especially when we're working with a partial profile. But the more locations that you would be able to compare to, the more informative that is.
Was there anything in your analysis or review of TLE 154 or item number 6 that gave you any concerns about the testing or the accuracy of it?
No.
Did you ever compare any other known profiles to that sample?
No.
So I want to go back to the fingernails. You testified briefly earlier, then we moved on, that you did an initial testing which didn't reveal any profiles. But as you said, at some point you retested them, right?
Yes.
And can you explain sort of what led to that and what was behind the review?
So we had determined that the extraction kit that we were using at the time that were used on the samples collected from the fingernails, there was a component in the extraction kit that was inhibiting the samples. It was resulting in samples that we may have expected to yield some type of DNA profile. Later on down the road, later on down the road of the DNA process, they were not producing that profile. So we were extracting them. We were in that second stage of the process where we determine how much DNA is present. We were obtaining some type of quant value at that stage, but then when we would run it all the way through the end, we were not obtaining a DNA profile. So we had done a review of the cases that we had used that extraction kit for to determine if there were any samples that we thought may or possibly could have been affected by that the inhibitor in that kit, and went back and retested those extracts.
So I'm going to ask about how you retested, but you used the word quant value. Can you explain that a little bit to the jury?
So in that second step of the DNA process that I had explained, where we determine approximately how much DNA is present in the sample, that's called the quant. So that produces a quant value, essentially a concentration of the DNA that's present in the sample.
And you said you went back and retested. Can you describe how you retested the samples?
So we passed the original DNA extracts that were originally sampled and extracted through a filter that is manufactured to remove inhibitors from DNA extracts. So that's what the purpose of the filter is. So we took these DNA extracts that we felt could possibly have been affected and ran them through that filter upon receiving them back, and then picked up with the DNA process again. We went back and re-quanted them to determine how much now the quant value would be, and then went on to amplify them and analyze those samples. So essentially sort of started the process over a little bit.
And did you say that the problem was identified by a single kit, or was it part of a process that was the problem?
It was a single kit that we were using in one step of the process. So it was a kit a kit meaning a set of reagents that we were using in the extraction process for a certain type of extraction.
So when you did the new process and retested, did you use that kit or?
No, once we identified that inhibitor, we ceased using that kit.
Now, how were the protocols developed for going through this process to retest it?
So the only additional step in the testing process would have been that filter cleanup. So we put together a SOP, a standard operating procedure, on how to handle receiving extracts in and performing that filter cleanup process. But as far as documenting that, the filter itself is not, it's a common filter that's already used in many DNA extractions, so it's not something that, we invented or anything like that. It's a filter that's designed to purify DNA extracts. It's used in some of the more manual DNA extractions. This particular extraction that was infected by the inhibitor was a robotic extraction, the kit that goes along with that. So we were just passing the samples through that filter, and we came up with, after this was determined, we just kind of documented a set of guidelines, a set of instructions to follow, as we were expecting people to send back in these purified extracts. So we would have a step-by-step process to follow, and then just pick right back up with the DNA process.
And for the fingernail samples that went through this process, were there any issues or concerns about the quality of the DNA process?
Nope.
So when you retested it, were you able to generate profiles out of any of these 4 items?
So of the 4 sets of fingernail clippings, we retested 3 of them. The EX03-1 was not retested. And that we had done, again, I had mentioned this, but we had done a review. We went back and did an extensive review of all of the cases that we thought could have been affected and determined which ones were suitable, that we felt were suitable for this process. So we determined that EX01-1, 02-1, and 04-1 we believed were suitable for retesting. So those were the 3 that were sent forward.
And 3-1 not being suitable, was that unrelated to the issue with the kit?
03-1 produced, I don't recall all of the specifics for what exactly we were evaluating when it came to which samples were going to be suitable for the retesting process. I do know it had to do with the quant value, and EX03-1 did not produce a quant value to begin with, so therefore it originally producing no result was not necessarily unexpected. So I believe that that was the main reason why we did not go back and retest that sample.
And for these 3 profiles that were generated, did you then do a comparison to the known reference sample of Timothy Verrill?
Yes.
And we can just go from left to right, starting with EX01-1. What were the conclusions for that sample?
We determined that he was excluded as a contributor.
Your Honor, may I approach?
Yes.
Ms. Sears, just like I asked with EX061, can you circle the locations that led to the exclusion? And moving on to the next column, EX02-1. What were the conclusions from the comparison analysis for that?
We again determined that he was excluded as a contributor.
And can you do the same for that column, please? And then for the final sample, EX04-1, did you draw conclusions from the comparison analysis?
Yes.
And what were those?
We also determined again that he was excluded as a contributor.
Can you circle the locations again? And for the third column that's left blank, you discussed earlier that basically no DNA material was found. Is that essentially the same as having an NR, or are there any other conclusions you can draw from that?
Yes, so the results prior to the retesting with the filter were, for the fingernail clippings, were released in the first report. So that sample would have been released with a set of NRs. And then in the final report, when the results of the retesting of the fingernail clippings were released, this sample was not included in that report because we did not retest it. So the only results that we have for that sample would have been no profile.
And can you use the vocabulary of exclude, or when is there different vocabulary when there's just nothing that's recovered?
It would be different vocabulary. It would be essentially inconclusive. There's nothing to compare to.
Right. There was no male DNA found on that.
Nothing that was generated, correct.
And like with the rings of EX06-1, it would still be possible to compare these profiles to other known male samples, right?
Yes.
And were you ever asked to, or did you ever compare other male profiles to these samples?
No, we only received the one reference from Timothy.
And when you completed your comparisons and reports, did you send your findings back to the state of New Hampshire?
Yes.
One moment, please. That's all I have for you for now. The state will have some questions.
All right, thank you. Cross-examination.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So I want to start by talking with you sort of generally about YSTR testing. Okay. So the purpose of YSTR testing would be when an item being tested might contain a large amount of female DNA and a relatively minute amount of male DNA, and we want to focus on that male DNA, right?
That is one use for it, yes.
And because YSTR testing looks at DNA on the Y chromosome, that's why it's only found in males, right?
Correct.
So I want to ask you some questions about how that appears for comparison purposes. So the jury has already seen some charts for what I'll just describe as non-YSTR DNA testing. Okay. And at each of the 23 locations, there are typically two numbers.
Correct.
Is that because we get half the DNA from our father and half from our mother?
Yes.
So when we're looking at YSTR and we only have one number, is that because we're only seeing the DNA contributed from the father?
Right, the one copy, yes.
So if we were to see two numbers in a YSTR profile, would that mean that there were two male contributors?
There are certain locations that can be looked at on in a YSTR profile that can show up as two repeats. For example, DYS 385 is a location that normally each individual will show as having two repeats at. That has to do with the structure of that location. It's actually a duplicate there. But with the exception of those few locations, I believe there are a couple more depending on the kit that you're looking at. In this particular kit, it's just the DYS 385. But barring that location, for this kit, yes, another number would indicate, could possibly indicate a mixture.
So now I want to talk a little bit about touch DNA. And when we talk about touch DNA, we're talking about DNA somebody leaves behind just by touching an object, right?
By coming in contact, yes.
And absent sort of human interference or exposure to the elements, things like that, is it fair to say touch DNA can remain on a surface or an item for days or weeks at a time?
That's a possibility. There are a lot of factors that can go into that. You know, some of which you mentioned, weather conditions, temperatures, storage, how something's sampled, an individual themselves, different individuals are different statuses of shedding, essentially we call it. So some people leave behind more DNA than others. So there are a lot of factors that go into that we can't necessarily quantify. But it is possible, you know, if all the stars align, you know, that it can be left behind for some time.
And there's a difference between touch DNA and wearer DNA, right? Wearer DNA is typically something that has been exposed to a person's skin or skin cells for a longer period of time.
Touch DNA, people use the term touch DNA in the field very broadly. So a lot of people will use the term just to mean any DNA that can be left behind. But, you know, wearer DNA is definitely a term that is used as well. And it would be just as you explained it, as something that's left behind by a wearer, but it's also DNA that's left behind when a person is coming into contact, just a different type of contact.
And touch DNA can be left on an item just by casual contact with that item, right?
That's possible, yes.
Touch DNA can also be transferred to third parties, right?
Really, any type of DNA that's left behind can be transferred, could have the potential to be transferred to another item or by another person. Any DNA that's left on any type of surface or on an item that someone wears or comes in contact with for a long period of time does have the potential to be transferred if another person were to come in contact with it.
So if I touch an item, leave my DNA, somebody else touches it, and then touches something else, my DNA could end up on that third item even though I've never touched it.
That's possible, yes. Again, there's a lot of factors that go into that, but that we don't necessarily know how to determine, but it is a possibility, yes.
So when you do find touch DNA on an item, is that why you say you can't necessarily conclude that that DNA means a person actually touched that item?
Correct.
Or how long that DNA has been there?
Correct.
So I want to talk specifically about some of the items that Defense Counsel just talked with you with, and we'll start with the rings belonging to Christine Sullivan, which were designated as 6-1, I believe, in your lab. You said you developed a partial profile for those rings?
Correct.
And I think you described it as very partial, right?
Yes.
And talking about that quantitation stage that you mentioned earlier, where you test the quantity of the DNA left behind, the amount of DNA on those rings was very small, right?
The value was, yes, would be considered a lower quantity.
And that's measured in nanograms per microliter. Is that right?
Yes, it's a concentration.
And
So counsel, jurors need to take a short break. We're going to break for about 5 minutes, okay? And then we'll come right back into the courtroom. Thank you.
Please remain standing, jury entering. Please be seated.
All right, counsel, you can resume when you're ready.
Thank you. So right before the break, we were talking about quantitation and the amount of DNA that's found on a particular item. And I had asked, that is measured in nanograms per microliter, is that right?
Correct.
And a nanogram is a billionth of a gram.
Yes.
So we're talking about very small numbers here.
Yes.
And like we talked about earlier, specifically with the ring, which was Exhibit 6-1, you can't conclude that whoever's DNA was on that ring actually touched it.
Correct.
You can't conclude whether that was transfer DNA,
Correct.
and you can't tell when that DNA was deposited on the ring.
Correct.
You're not able to offer any type of conclusion that the person whose DNA is on that ring is the person who killed Christine, are you?
No.
So now I want to move on to the fingernails, and we'll start with Jenna Pellegrini, and we can talk about both together, which was Exhibit 1-1 and 2-1. Similar to the ring, you were able to develop a partial profile from both sets of those fingernails.
Correct.
And again, there was a relatively small amount of DNA that was found on those fingernails.
Yes.
And you can't offer a conclusion as to when that DNA was left there,
No.
or whether it was transferred DNA,
No.
or whether the DNA found under Jenna's fingernails is the DNA of the person who killed her.
No. Correct.
And specifically with regards to fingernails, DNA can be left on a person's fingernails also as a result of casual contact, just like touching an item, right?
I'm sure it would depend on how that person came into contact with something. The thought when sampling the underside of fingernails is to generally try to collect DNA when an individual may have used their fingernails to scratch or to come in sort of rough contact with something. But that type of contact could occur in various situations.
And now we'll move on to Christine's fingernails. And the only profile you developed with regard to her fingernails was Exhibit 4-1, right?
Correct.
And once again, that was a partial profile.
Yes.
And there was a very small amount of DNA found on those fingernails.
Yes.
You can't offer any conclusion as to when it was left there,
Correct.
or whether it was transfer DNA,
Correct.
or whether the DNA under Christine's fingernails was left by the person who killed her.
Correct.
If I could have one moment, Judge.
Yes.
Thank you. That's all I have.
Any redirect?
Thank you. Real quickly, does the volume of DNA affect your confidence in an exclusion?
No, it does not affect my confidence in what was obtained. It doesn't affect my confidence in my comparison to what was obtained, but it would have an effect on what was obtained.
Thank you.
Any recross?
No, thank you.
Thank you. Ma'am, you may step down. You're excused. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Defense?
Defense press.
Thank you. Does the state intend to offer any rebuttal evidence?
No, Judge.
So, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the evidence in in the case. The defense has rested. The state is not offering any further evidence in rebuttal. So given the hour, it's 3:45. What we're going to do is come back tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, at which time we'll have the closing arguments of counsel, the final instructions, and then the jury will have the case for deliberation at the end of the final instructions. In the meantime, do not discuss the case with anyone. Even though the evidence is done, you still are not free to discuss the case until after you've heard the arguments and my instructions. Do not do any research and avoid any exposure to any media overnight. Okay? All right, thank you. We'll see you tomorrow.
All rise, jury exited.
Have a seat just for a moment. I've been thinking about this since last night, whether I should bring this up, but I think I should. This goes to the jury instructions. There was an order from Judge Horan back in October of 2019 regarding certain evidence that the state intended to offer on consciousness of guilt. 4 of those categories he allowed to be admissible. I think there were 3 or 4 other categories he did not allow. And at the end of his order, he said he would give an appropriate instruction to the jury on consciousness of guilt, and a limiting instruction during trial if requested. A limiting instruction was not requested during trial. However, given the language of his order, I felt it probably best to ask if either side wanted a consciousness of guilt instruction. So this has to do with the phone allegedly discarded and a new one, the leaving the brother's house with the car. There were 2 others. They'll come to me, but those were the issues. State, did you wish for a consciousness of guilt instruction?
No, Judge, I'm satisfied with the instructions.
All right, and defense?
No.
Okay.
Review the instruction, but no.
Right, so it would be a modified version of the flight instruction.
Right.
Essentially, it's this evidence could be used in this manner, but it's up to the jury what to believe and how to use it. So with that, you don't wish one either? But tell you what we can do. There won't be a lot of time tomorrow, but if you could make a decision by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning and just let me know by email. You folks have my email address. You can let me know if you want one. Now, in part of your consideration, I think the jury needs to be told there are 4 issues. The jury needs to be told what those 4 issues are and how consciousness of guilt may reflect on those. So I don't usually like to call out specific evidence, but in this case, I think I would need to. Because it's not as simple, there's one issue like flight. There are 4 different issues that are in play, 4 different factual issues.
Right.
Okay?
Okay.
That's what I'm thinking anyway, so let me know by tomorrow morning.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you.
All rise.